Hello again. I know it's a bit of a bore, but I thought I would just do one more video to address the criticisms that some people have levelled at me in the comments here. One of the criticisms which crops up again and again is that I'm accused of justifying the transatlantic slave trade or downplaying its severity. People seem to think that because I talk about slavery in Africa, that means that I think that slavery in America and the Caribbean weren't that bad. It's really mad. It's how can I put it? Jack the Ripper was a serial killer, and lots of books have been written about him. Not as many books have been written about, say, the American Zodiac killer. If I started speaking about the Zodiac killer on videos, that wouldn't mean to say that I was saying that Jack the Ripper wasn't a dreadful killer or that his crimes weren't as bad as people think. It would simply mean that I don't want to look at the same serial killer that everybody else in the world seems to focus on. It's partly also my own fault because I don't append words such as shocking, tragic, disgusting, awful or horrifying every time that I talk about something which is unpleasant. In the absence of such condemnation, when I mention, for example, the transatlantic slave trade, seems to some people to be taken as a lack of condemnation or even an endorsement that it was okay. This is probably a generational thing. These days, even the police and government, when they're making statements, feel that they have to add in some emotional words. So we get things like 153 more people sadly died of coronavirus, or tragically 3 people were killed. I tend to take it for granted that the death of people is tragic, and I also take it for granted that we all know that slavery of any kind is wicked and wrong. It shouldn't need to be said. I mean, I think most of us know this already. So there's no point in my saying every time the subject crops up, oh, and by the way, the transatlantic slave trade was very wrong. Why would I do that? I thought I'd mention, though, that I've written about the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade, and I've written about the conditions of slaves in the Caribbean in great detail. I realise that a lot of the people commenting here don't read books, so they're not likely to have come across what I've said. But I thought I'd read a small part from one of my books about the conditions of slaves in Jamaica in the 18th century, just to show that I'm perfectly well aware of how terrible it was, and that I'm probably more aware of it than most people. I'm going to quote from one of my books. It's a History of Torture in Britain, published by Pen and Sword. I would advise people that are a little squeamish or about to eat not to listen. Okay, I've written here in the book about a man called Thomas Thistlewood, who emigrated from England to Jamaica in 1750 when he was 29 years of age. His papers are now kept at Yale University. They can be consulted online if you're an academic. He kept a very detailed diary, and there's no reason to suppose he was an exceptionally bad slave owner. He was typical for his time. It's just that most people didn't keep such diaries. For example, he recorded every time he had sexual intercourse. He had intercourse 3,852 times with 138 different women, and they were nearly all black slaves. So really, this makes him one of the most prolific rapists of all time, which is worth considering in itself. At any rate, he renamed all his slaves. He couldn't be doing with their African names. He called them names such as Egypt, Derby, Hector, Port Royal, and so on. And I'm going to read out a couple of entries in his diary so that you'll get some idea of just how slaves in the Caribbean were treated in the 18th century. On the 28th of January 1756, he noted in his diary that he was annoyed to find one of the slaves had been eating bits of sugar cane. While they were harvesting sugar cane, some of the slaves used to eat bits of the cane. Thistlewood got angry at that, so he wrote, "Had Derby well whipped and made Egypt shit in his mouth." Anything worse can hardly be imagined, but he made a habit of this sort of thing. In 1 week in July, his diary entries read as follows. Let's see, 23rd of July, 1756. A slave had run away and Thistlewood had him flogged and then had lime juice rubbed in the wounds to increase the pain. Then he wrote, made Hector shit in his mouth, immediately put in a gag whilst his mouth was full and made him wear it 4 or 5 hours. The following day, on the 24th, a female slave was also punished by having another slave defecate in her mouth. On the Friday, 30th of July, a slave called Punch had run away and was caught. Thistlewood wrote, Punch catched at Salt River and brought home, flogged him well, and then washed and rubbed in salt pickle, lime juice and bird pepper. Also whipped Hector for losing his hoe, made new Negro Joe piss in his eyes and mouth. I mean, it makes all comments superfluous. Do the people commenting here really think that I improve with such behaviour, or that I don't realise how terrible slavery in the Caribbean was? I might mention, by the way, that I could match anecdotes like that from North Africa. It's not that these are... Yeah, the Caribbean slaves were treated abysmally. So were some white slaves in Africa, there's no doubt about that. But only slaves could be treated in this way. That is to say, people that were owned almost like domestic animals. The indentured labourers wouldn't have been treated like this, nor would people transported to Barbados following, say, the Monmouth Rising in the 17th century. This is something specifically you can do to slaves who you own and can dispose of as you will, the way you would an animal. Anyway, it'll be back to normal tomorrow. I hope that people haven't got too irritated hearing me defend myself against what's been in some of the comments here, but it's enough for me to say now that I'm perfectly familiar with slavery in the Caribbean and I know how terrible it was, and I don't think it was a good thing.